Why is Avatar good now? I don't understand. You used to be able to say stuff like, who's Jake Sully? Nobody knows who Jake Sully is.
I don't think there is a single person here today that will be able to name one character from Avatar.
And people would think that was cool and funny. Now everyone says they know who Jake Sully is. It's not natural. Avatar had no cultural... The woke agenda's going crazy. You used to be able to say praise Jesus, but now you gotta say praise Awa. You're not allowed to dislike it anymore. You gotta like Avatar. It's against the rules now. If you say no, the little whales will go, wah. What's going on? Oh, could you pause for a minute? I distinctly remember the first time I saw Avatar. In 2008, I was 14, I guess, and I went with my mum. It was like a packed screening because it was like maybe a week or so after like the hype had started to build up around it, but I hadn't really paid attention to it. It wasn't like I set my expectations too high type thing. I was just like, whatever. I sort of realized maybe 10 or 15 minutes in that every time a scene started in the movie, I instantly knew what was going to happen in that scene and what the next scene most likely was going to be. And I know that's a very subjective criticism, but I think for me, on a very personal level, the way my tastes tend to work is when I can easily predict every single thing that's going to happen, it really wears me down, and that is what I felt intensely the entire time I was watching the film. I couldn't connect with any of the characters because they all just felt like vehicles for this almost AI-generated level, predictable plotline. And like, you know, the stuff that I've talked about in other videos, the white savior narrative, like that plays into it because it's all of these very like tropey type things. Are tropes inherently bad? No, I just said it was a highly subjective criticism. We got to the part where the tree fell down and we looked around us and saw there were people like crying. Like there were people that were really emotionally invested in this moment. And I think we both kind of realized at that point that whatever this movie was trying to do, we weren't gonna get it. Avatar is, in fact, the only time I've actually walked out on a movie before it finished. I think if we hadn't just gotten a dog, I probably would have just stayed for the sake of it. We both genuinely wanted to spend time with our new dog more than we wanted to finish this film we'd paid to see. I think actually we made it to like the climax fighting part, and that was the part where we left because we were like, okay, there's nothing else we're gonna get out of this at this point. It wasn't like that far from the end of it. I never liked Avatar. I was never part of the hatedom. Didn't have a grudge against James Cameron. I consumed it, and it was like eating cilantro or coriander. I have the thing that makes it soap to me is also the thing that makes Avatar a grotesque product. I have nothing against people that like it. Some of my best friends are Avatar heads. I feel like I've come to appreciate it a little bit more on reflection. Like when I did do the video that I did, I found things about Avatar I probably wouldn't have appreciated otherwise. I like a lot of the aliens and stuff, even though I feel like a lot of them don't go quite far enough. There's a slight campiness to it, even though again I don't feel like it goes as far as it could. But yeah, overwhelming sort of just like that's my vibe. And I've always intensely disliked just how the blue people look. They look like kind of these airbrush kind of deviant art, or maybe like furry art, but like sort of 80s era furry art, or like the kind of furry art you might see on like a how to draw furry art like coloring book from the 90s. And you know, for a long time the internet was my safe space for people that also felt similarly about this movie. However, over the last few years we've seen an AVATARnaissance.
Love it. It was excellent. I love the way they brought them back. It's excellent. Can't wait for the next one. I was bored.
We are currently en route to Avatar 2, the sequel to a movie that I know that I dislike, that by all accounts appears to be very similar to the first one. I think this is the most dead dove thing that I've ever done. I was asked to give it a chance, so I'm gonna do my best. I hope to be caught up in the AVATARnaissance sweep, as everyone else seems to be right now. I look forward to finally being able to hopefully understand the magic of Avatar, and to finally be a part of the Na'vi ally community. The thing about the Na'vi is they've got all their stuff, how they want to preserve their way of life, but like they're never gonna have this, you know? They're never gonna have this. I feel bad for them, honestly. What do they get? The tree? You want to go to the tree for the 1000th time, brother Frakenik? I don't know how Na'vi names work.
Look, Zaxby's.
Oh, or we could go to the world tree again. I know I'm gonna dislike. I know I'm not gonna like it. So I didn't hate it. I didn't hate Avatar 2. Back in 2009, if you said you didn't like Avatar, that was cool and good, and everyone liked you. Now liking Avatar is gay. And being gay is good. What's going on? Used to be like an Avatar made you racist. Now it's racist to not. Sounds like one rule for me, and another rule for Na'vi. Up is down. Big tree. We all love the big tree now. I'm supposed to think this is sexy now? Because I do. What's going on? I'll play ball and ask, what's up with the Avatar love all of a sudden? We all know you can't trust Rotten Tomatoes critic scores, but nowadays you can't even trust Rotten Tomatoes audience scores. According to that, people always liked Avatar. But it ain't right. I remember, we all hated it. We all agreed that we didn't like it. I've just been informed that actually James Cameron is racist. I've always liked Avatar. Finally, an antidote to Disney's woke agenda. Obviously, for the non-online, you're probably just thinking, I liked the first Avatar, I guess, and now I've enjoyed the second one as well. I think James Cameron has a very clear sense of what, like, normal people just generally think of as, like, good, fun, pretty, you know, better than I ever would. I'll never be able to make a movie that's the most financially successful of all time. You should not bet against James Cameron, I think. So to some extent, any attempt to create this, like, AVATARnaissance, like Avatar's coming back around in the cultural consciousness thing, it's kind of fake. It's always been kind of just there, dormant, you know. Normal people, they'll watch something and then kind of forget about it over time, and it's fine, and they might not talk about it for like a decade. It's not like the terminally online, who will just keep talking about the thing over and over forever. Maybe we'll talk about The Last Jedi again next week. We'll just keep talking. We'll just keep talking about the same things. We'll just keep talking about the same things over and over, and it will never stop. That's the online world. If you are online, I feel like you've maybe have noticed that people have started to come around a little bit on Avatar. How for a certain set of people, it was always kind of a movie that was mocked. The common talking points, that it didn't really have this cultural, it didn't make these big cultural touchstone things. You don't remember the names of the characters or whatever. I didn't like Avatar, and I still knew his name was Jake Sully, okay? And I really didn't like Avatar. I'm not joking, I did walk out the first time I watched it. But at the same time, if you want to get into my headspace at that age, I liked Zack Snyder's Watchmen. You might not approve of that. You might want to cancel me for it, but that's what I believe, that's what I think. I'm not doing another Elon Musk video. You won't leave me alone. And look, I'm one of those guys. I think Avatar is a white savior thing. I think fundamentally I'm always going to feel like this ecological, anti-colonial kind of narrative just isn't really compatible with what's obviously like a utopian, wish fulfillment, power fantasy, escapism. Obviously, if you just want to make a lot of money and pull in large crowds, those are two fairly agreeable things. But I really feel like when we talk about escapism, often it's built on these kinds of tropes that go completely against this kind of anti-colonial art.
Avatar was, I suppose, you could say, is an attempt to kind of have your cake and eat it too. Do the mythic, heroic kind of story with a sense of destiny and big epic battles and all that, but have the dystopian cautionary component to that, you know, and have one be the spoonful of sugar to the other.
To me, Pandora is always just going to feel like a promotional video for a resort. It's like this beautiful, like harmonious, natural fantasy image of a world. And it gives me this very like religious, dualistic idea where we're only really comparing like the real world in which there's actual material issues to like this idealized like fantasy perfect existence that no one's ever going to be able to actually match up to. Implicit in Pandora is this idea that they're constantly in this state of like harmonious balance. You don't get a great sense of like droughts or famines or anything like that. There's actually like a supreme super intelligence that's making sure that everything's kind of staying in this state of general balance. Like they don't even have to have like these theoretical moral arguments. It's ducks. They like Avatar. It's a kind of a duck friendly, it's like, you know, the way of water. Ducks are into that kind of thing. There's the seedy material human world, and then there is the perfect natural world of Pandora. Awa is a kind of like planetary operating system mixed with an actual deity. They don't even have to have this like Brave New World debate of like, oh well, we've created this world of like a perfect order where everyone seems to be happy. Is this like an authentic existence? Is this really like what people really want? They don't need to worry about it because they can plug into Awa and Awa can probably just tell them. It's such a perfect world, and obviously that's supposed to be contrasted against humanity, and I think in the end it actually creates something that's so separated from our real worlds that we really lose a lot of the sort of deeper anti-colonial or ecological messaging. In a way, I think you do end up with something that's so removed from the material world that people are just as likely to come out of it going like, oh wow, that was such a beautiful place. There's this resort in Ethiopia I heard about. It's a very easily recuperated piece of media for some reason. It ends up just kind of removing people, allowing them to escape from our world for a bit, then to come back and just kind of look at what we've done with shame. Rather than to think constructively, to just imagine ourselves in this absolute perfect world where, like, you know, you can just jump on a fish and you can be best pals and just ride together into the ocean. When human beings do that with dolphins, that's like bad. But, you know, I guess Awa said it was cool, so they don't have to worry about it. You can't climb into a whale's mouth and just hang out for a bit. And that sucks. Like post-Pandora depression. Yeah, I can understand how someone would feel that way when you've created this piece of media that really just says, fuck Earth. fuck the hellspawn that came from Earth. Am I saying that the film should have been nicer to like the obvious analogy for like a settler colonial group? No, I don't feel that way. At the point where they had decided that the story was essentially going to be like a Pocahontas, these are the Native Americans, they're blue now, and then, yeah, their hands were pretty tied, I guess, as long as you wanted to keep it within this very simplistic Disney narrative, which, yeah, again, you want broad appeal.
Had to take note, you know, there was a Flying Dutchman on the internet who basically compared Pocahontas line by line to the outline of this, and you know, it's a good laugh, but at the same time,
I debated having the Colors of the Wind song. Actually, no, we intentionally wanted to use familiar touchstones of storytelling that were historical and reflect them through a lens from the future, so that I could take some of these more difficult concepts, seed them in there, and people would pick them up along the way, because that's all they had to trip over were those ideas, and not the big, not the big gestural stuff.
Right.
As far as my big brain reasons that I disagree with Avatar, that's how I feel. Again, I'm always going to be able to separate that from my general enjoyment of things, and I just don't enjoy the first Avatar. Like cucumbers, right? You love cucumbers, right? I don't like cucumbers. I think they're really gross, and it's weird because I like pickled cucumber. I like pickles. On a pure experiential level, I'm just not into it. But for big brain reasons, that's my take. I actually really respect the fact that they stuck with the papyrus font for the entire movie. Going into it, me being like, oh, I've heard it's basically the same movie again. It's definitely not. You know, my criticisms of the first movie on a personal level were that it was incredibly rote. It was this very simple and sort of straightforward story, this like Romeo and Juliet, Pocahontas thing. And it's like, I know who those characters are, and it's like 2.5 hours of, you know. And this movie is like the opposite. This movie is like 9 different stories that are all kind of like, they pick up on one and then pick up on another, and they all kind of seem like they're gonna be going in some interesting, maybe unexpected directions. It's like there's too much almost, and there's the story of the Colonel and how the Colonel has now been revived as a Na'vi, and it's like, oh, how's he gonna feel about the fact that now he is essentially the enemy? And that doesn't really go anywhere. The Spider, who, you know, is a human that was raised by the Na'vi, but maybe he's always had this sort of disconnection as a result of that. And then he gets like taken in by the Colonel. There's like the daughter that's connected with Awa. And then there's this whole thing about how she's sort of connecting with Awa, but each time it's sort of hurting her and she's having seizures. And if she connects to Awa again, she could die, and they don't really do anything with that. There's this whole thing with like the Ocean Tribe where they have this sacred rule about killing, and then how that's maybe going to put them at odds with Jake's son, who's connected with this like traitor whale character. It's like a 2.5 hour movie where it's sort of like 15 minutes distributed for each storyline, spread out in amongst the whole thing. Not getting into the weirdness with the plot itself. Like, Jake decides he has to leave the forest because Spider could give away where his family lives. Is that the thing? I thought that the military in Avatar was like colonizing the planet. I didn't realize they were just sort of like looking for Jake Sully. Is that the whole thing? Like, they're putting like so many resources into getting revenge on Jake Sully. Like, it's not even a tactical thing, because he gives up being the leader of the tree people like 20 minutes in. Itself, incredibly bizarre. Especially given that at the end of the movie, it's like the moral is like, oh, actually, we can't run away. We actually can't run away from the sky people. Didn't he know this like halfway through the first movie? And I feel like I maybe would have understood it a little bit better if Jake wasn't essentially a sort of supporting character in this movie. He narrates parts of the movie, but he also, again, just disappears for large chunks of the story, and it makes it very hard to really understand his thought process.
It's not unobtainium anymore. I guess unobtainium was unattainable. But right now they're doing like the brain goo of the whales.
Yeah, do they even mention unobtainium?
This is why we're here.
No, they don't.
That, on top of everything else, they introduced the whale brain goo like 2 hours in. It's like if they introduced unobtainium like at the start of the final act. Like, oh god, there's so many things in this movie. The greatest travesty of all is that they introduced Carmela Soprano as like the head of the military. She's got a robot suit, she's like duking it out, and then she's just not there anymore.
Well, quite literally, they showed her in the scene where she was torturing Spider, trying to get information out of him. And then the Na'vi colonel was like, let me take it from here. And then I think that's the last time I recall seeing her. I think that was the last time she was in the movie.
The whale hunter guys, they also just disappear at a certain point. And I know that there's like the guy, he gets his arm chopped off and then he falls in the water. But when you're cut like here, when your arm gets cut off here in a movie and then you'll just go off screen, that to me says you're definitely going to just come back like with a prosthetic arm. This is the golden zone in terms of you will be back in the next movie. And I know who the other guy is. He's a Flight of the Conchords guy. He was the big shellfish man in Moana.
Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson?
I would have loved it if Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson was in this movie. It's very palpably a part of a series now, in the way that the first movie was kind of self-contained. It's a messy movie. But I like messy movies in a way where I don't so much like an incredibly straightforward story, which is how I felt about the first one. I'm going to take a minute, I'm going to figure out my thoughts, and then I will produce my takes. On reflection, I think part of the reason I liked Avatar 2 more was probably because it felt like it was less of a message. If you want the actual moral of the movie, because it's quite straightforward, Jake realizes that his family isn't just like him and his partner and his kids, right? His family is also his tribe, you know, his community. It's like this bigger thing. And you might be thinking, you know, like, oh, so kind of like the message of the first movie. Yeah, it's a lot like that. Except now, rather than it being this very straightforward, like, environmental, you know, ransacking of the environment by this corporation in cooperation with the military, and then the Na'vi kind of being in their way thing. Now that's replaced with, for the most part, a story about a guy that wants revenge. So many interesting directions that the story seemed like it was going in, kind of ends up just shaking out to be a movie about the guy from the first movie trying really hard to kill Jake Sully. There's a lot of things that happen. I think the cast is bigger. Very clear sense that they are setting a lot of things up for Avatars 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And obviously we're in the era of like episodic storytelling. I do keep up with Marvel media, so I'd be kind of a hypocrite for pretending that that's like a damnable offense. But I feel like the Marvel movies that I tend to like a little bit more still tend to have like a message that works in a self-contained kind of way with the narrative, and then there's just kind of additional things that you're going to get if you are familiar with the whole thing. Avatar, it just kind of felt like the baseline story had very little to it, and then all of the potentially interesting things were not that explored. When they do the thing like, oh, Kiri could have a seizure and then it could be really bad, she connects with Awa again and then nothing happens. Yeah, it's fine, because I guess that, yeah, wait until the next movie. It feels to me like the stuff with Kiri, the stuff with Spider, the stuff with, I guess, Jake Sully's son, and Quaritch, that is all potentially interesting, and they kind of set a lot of things up. But yeah, you kind of just have to wait for the next one for that. In terms of like bringing the story to something, in terms of like getting to something meaningful, there's not much there. But I also feel like the film kind of cares less about that. Where the first movie was so laboriously bringing you over this incredibly straightforward story, just incredibly transparent narrative, yeah, it becomes kind of obnoxious. Even if you don't have big Reddit takes like I do. But, you know, it's goofy. Like, when all the Na'vi kids just getting in a dispute and they just, like, all get in a fight, they just start fighting each other, that's fun. We all love that.
Jake Sully mocking. I admire your courage. Colonel, I imagine bravery isn't something you're accustomed to. Jake Sully, challenging me isn't my idea of bravery. Colonel, firm. I won't tolerate vigilante justice. Then keep out of Pandora. Branding your victims, murder, what separates you from them? So I should have stood by and let you destroy the planet? The people you've killed may be criminals, but they're fathers, sons, brothers. You've crossed the line, and I can't accept that. Tell that to my own snap neck.
I don't really have like a comprehensive Avatar-free pitch. I think because of the nature of the back-to-back production cycle, a lot of the threads that were left by Avatar 2 are clearly going to be picked up on. There's going to be more stuff with like Kiri. Who is Kiri the child of? Is Kiri the child of Awa? Is Kiri the child of Awa? Maybe Kiri's the child of Awa. It could be any number of things, like perhaps Awa. There's going to be more stuff with Spider. The Colonel is probably going to go on a sort of Terminator-esque anti-villain trajectory. Maybe he'll realise in a sort of dramatic, climactic moment, he'll realise the error of his ways, and he'll sacrifice himself, and that'll be kind of his one redeeming moment. Could be something like that, maybe, I don't know. There's going to be... But what I have heard is that the third movie is going to focus on a sort of antagonistic Na'vi tribe. And I think obviously that kind of story can be done well, or it can be done poorly. It could be like a savages.
Barely even human, different from us, which means they can't be trusted.
Both sides bad. Very reductive narrative, which is obviously already a concern when you've done what these movies have done with the Native American analogy. But, you know, based on the things I've been saying about the movie, I would like to see some kind of questioning of this binary between the sort of pure and good Na'vi world, idealized fantasy world that we get to experience through these movies, and like the seedy human material world. So to kind of question that a little bit more so. I think this sort of hard binary has ended up feeding into this escapist element to these stories. The idea that you come away from these movies just thinking, wow, humanity is fucked. The earth is fucked. I wish that I was a Na'vi. And then you kind of end up being no better than the characters in the movie that are just sort of inhabiting these native bodies so that they can entertain this alternative fantasy life. Like how strange the animosity is towards Jake and Spider, for instance. Like Jake Sully is still a human, right? On some level. And you would imagine this sort of connection he might have with Spider as being this kind of slightly out of place, like Awa. Obviously Awa is kind of an analogy for this deeper connection to nature, but it's also a physical god that the Na'vi can literally connect into. Humanity never had that. We never had a god we could just like connect up with so directly. What does that mean for humanity that we don't have that? You know, how did that affect our development? I think treating the Na'vi and Pandora as like a real group that has a history behind them that is affected by a multitude of things is the difference between them being props for escapism and something potentially interesting, something that people could potentially get a worthwhile message out of. That's stuff they could explore if they're willing to get beyond this like fairy tale storybook simplistic thing. But also, they could not, because I think James Cameron probably knows a lot more about how to make a movie that makes a lot of money than I do. If he's interested in what would make me personally like Avatar more, James, this is the video for you. And I've also heard that David Thewlis is going to be in the new thing, so I'd probably watch it anyway for that reason. It might be unfair, but I do genuinely kind of feel like at least some of the positivity when it comes to Avatar 2 does come out of just fatigue about the fact that superhero media has taken over. You know, superhero media has so thoroughly taken over the blockbuster zeitgeist that I think Avatar kind of feels like a breath of fresh air. Slightly depressing because we're just talking about like a different giant Disney fantasy franchise. Yeah, I guess we're just so thoroughly starved of like real diversity in terms of where our blockbusters are coming from. Avatar becomes a bit of rebellion for us. The monopolization of entertainment is happening. You should probably look up the origin of the game Monopoly. It's a function of our economic system that this is the way things are going to end up. Am I talking about Avatar because I think it's the most interesting piece of entertainment out there? Because it has the most worthwhile things to say? No, it's because it draws in a large crowd, both for an audience of viewers in the movie theatre and for an audience of people on a YouTube channel. And what draws in the big numbers, what draws in the crowds, is always going to have to kind of be filtered through this kind of majority softening out the edges. And then ultimately, that's best served by a corporation that has the resources to curate things in this way. Like, it makes sense that we're going to end up with this Disney monopoly. I've talked about Marvel movies on my channel, Pixar movies, and those videos tend to be the ones that do pretty well. People love hearing about Cars 2. I think there's always kind of going to be that conversation between what's bringing in the biggest crowds, which is usually going to be like the big, broad kind of like types of stories, things that are very easy to identify, and the reasons that things can be very easy to identify with can be pretty culturally informed. The kinds of wish fulfillment, escapist narratives that we're drawn to can often be built off of like bad histories, right? Things that we might want to be critical of in other contexts. And yeah, I think the most interesting art usually is some kind of commentary on that. But if you want to swing for a big crowd, you can't always just do that. And that's not wrong. You know, you have to take the world as it is. I remember, like, after university, I would try to kind of express the things that I was sort of thinking about as I was going through my education. And I sounded even more incoherent than I do in my usual YouTube videos. I'd spent all this time reading this stuff, writing this stuff down, but not just like talking to people, thinking about how specifically to translate the things I'm thinking about into like easy language that's accessible to the people I'm speaking to. That translation matters. It's just that all of it then ends up being filtered through a giant evil corporate machine. An alternative to the Disney supremacy is possible, and that's why this month I'm going to be recommending Andor, which is now available on Disney+. And yes, James Cameron said a very stupid thing. I would say if you want to support independent storytelling, you want to support real counterculture subversive content, check out Andor. Really you should though, it's a very good show. This is officially the last video of 2022. We are making content, everybody. I think several hours of video have now been produced since the channel came back in July. Thank you so much for the people that have been contributing over on the Patreon, people that have sent tips over on Ko-fi. That stuff, for reasons that I will be getting into in future videos, has really helped out a lot. Even for just what we've been able to achieve over the last few months, has meant a lot. Thank you. If you want to keep chipping in, you can use the links. There will be much more content coming in the next year. I feel better than ever. Folks, let's make some YouTube videos!